What would you do if the people you trusted most betrayed you in the most unimaginable way? For a sheriff devoted to his family and his duty, a single DNA test unraveled everything he believed in. His brother, his own flesh and blood, had fathered the children he had raised as his own. The revelation wasn't just a betrayal, it was a ticking time bomb, threatening to destroy his family, his career, and a fragile piece of the community he swore to protect. Faced with heartbreak, rage, and humiliation, the sheriff stood at a crossroads: uphold the law or give in to the pain that consumed him. How does a man sworn to protect and serve handle a betrayal so profound that it leaves him questioning everything he's ever believed in? And what happens when the pain becomes too much to bear? Before we dive into this heartbreaking case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Crimeberry Stories. This story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and loyalty. He was the backbone of the community, a sheriff known for his unwavering sense of justice and his deep commitment to the people he served. A devoted husband and father of 4, he embodied the values of loyalty, integrity, and family. In this small, tightly knit town of just over 2,000 people, where neighbors greeted each other by name and life moved at a steady, predictable pace, he was more than just a lawman. He was a symbol of stability. The town itself was the kind of place where secrets rarely stayed buried for long. Yet, some secrets were buried so deeply that their discovery could upend everything. It was during a routine DNA test, meant to address what seemed like a medical concern, that the sheriff stumbled upon a truth he could never have imagined. The results were unmistakable. The children he had loved, raised, and protected weren't biologically his. The truth cut like a knife. His brother, the man he had trusted without question, was their real father. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the ultimate betrayal. A theft of trust, love, and identity that shattered the foundation of his life. He confronted the results with a mix of disbelief and fury, his mind racing with the implications. How long had this been going on? How could the two people closest to him betray him so completely? Questions with no easy answers swirled in his mind as his once perfect world began to crumble. But this wasn't just a family scandal. It was the spark that would ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. Because what began as a shocking family secret would escalate into a tragic double murder that no one saw coming. The sheriff's life seemed like a blueprint for small-town success. He was the embodiment of integrity, respected by his colleagues, admired by his community, and adored by his family. Every morning, he donned his uniform with pride, knowing that his work kept the town safe and that his presence brought comfort to those who needed it most. As a father of 4, he was a constant in their lives, a protector, a teacher, a role model. His children loved him with the unquestioning devotion that only children can, and his wife Ella stood beside him as both a partner and a confidant. His commitment to duty and family made him a man of routine. He cherished the quiet moments, sitting around the dinner table, playing catch in the backyard, tucking his kids into bed at night. Everything about his life was stable, predictable, a quiet testament to the strength of family values and hard work. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form, cracks he never saw coming. His brother Jake had always been the opposite of him, spontaneous, carefree, and charismatic. Jake was the fun uncle, the one who showed up with no notice, bringing gifts and excitement. Where the sheriff was grounded, Jake was a whirlwind of energy, drawing people in with his charm. He was everything the sheriff wasn't, but they had always been close, more like best friends than brothers. They shared a bond forged through years of growing up together, and the sheriff never once questioned his brother's loyalty. Jake was a fixture in the sheriff's home. He'd stop by for dinner more often than not, spending time with the kids, telling stories, and playing games. At first, the sheriff found it endearing. His brother's easygoing nature was a welcome contrast to his own regimented life. But over the years, there were moments that made him uneasy. The way Jake lingered a little too long when his wife passed through the room. The stolen glances between them when they thought no one was looking. His wife Ella would sometimes smile a little too quickly when Jake arrived, as if a joke had just passed between them. But the sheriff brushed it off. After all, there was nothing concrete to worry about. It wasn't until a few months before the discovery that things started to feel off. The children, now older, began to show signs that didn't quite match the sheriff's family traits. His son's eyes were a striking shade of green, so unlike his own dark brown ones. His youngest daughter had the same laugh, the same dimples, as Jake. It was subtle at first, just little things, but the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The tipping point came when a comment from a neighbor sent a cold chill down his spine. The neighbor mentioned in passing how much his daughter resembled Jake when she was a child, and for the first time, the sheriff felt the unmistakable weight of suspicion. A gnawing doubt took root, and though he tried to dismiss it, it refused to leave. He wrestled with his thoughts. How could he possibly ask Ella? How could he confront Jake, the brother he had known his whole life? It was unbearable to even think about. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. After days of internal turmoil, he made a decision that would forever alter the course of his life. He ordered DNA tests for his children, a simple act of confirmation he thought would ease his mind. But in the pit of his stomach he knew, deep down he knew, that what he was about to uncover would be something far worse than he could ever imagine. The moment the sheriff saw the DNA results, the world as he knew it shattered. His hands trembled as he stared at the confirmation that cut deeper than any weapon could. His eyes scanned the paper, but the words were a blur, refusing to make sense. How could this be true? He had raised these children, loved them with every fiber of his being. Yet, the results told him everything he needed to know. His brother was their father. The shock hit first, like an unexpected blow to the chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. Then came denial, a desperate hope that it was some kind of mistake. But as he reread the results, a slow, undeniable rage began to rise within him. His heart pounded in his ears, his vision narrowing to a tunnel as anger consumed him. How could they do this to him? His brother, his wife, the people he trusted most. The devastation followed in waves, each one leaving him weaker than the last. His family, his life, had been built on a lie. The foundation crumbled beneath him, leaving nothing but the raw, unyielding truth. He sat there, stunned, unable to move, as the weight of his reality pressed down on him. It was only a matter of time before he confronted Ella and Jake. He could feel the tension in the air before he even walked into the room. Ella's eyes widened with surprise, quickly shifting to panic when she saw the paper in his hand. The words didn't come easy, but he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper, "Is this true?" At first, she denied it, her voice shaking with fear. She swore there must have been some mistake. But the longer he stood there, silent and unwavering, the more her facade crumbled. Slowly, hesitantly, she confessed. She told him everything. The affair that had begun years ago, the lies they'd built their lives on, the secret that had eaten away at her conscience until it was too late to take back. She begged for his forgiveness, but the words fell on deaf ears. The sheriff felt numb, a cold rage growing inside him that he could neither explain nor control. Jake was no better. He was defiant at first, even smug, as if he had done nothing wrong. He spoke of the passion they had shared, the love he had for Ella, as if it excused his betrayal. But the sheriff saw right through it. Jake wasn't sorry. He wasn't remorseful. He was arrogant, treating the situation like some sick game, as if the lives he had ruined didn't matter. The sheriff's mind raced as he tried to reconcile everything he had just learned. His family, his own flesh and blood, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He couldn't fathom how to move forward, how to face the people in his town who looked up to him, how to raise his children in a world where trust had been so completely destroyed. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and unrelenting torment. He couldn't escape the images of his children's faces, knowing the truth behind their smiles. He couldn't look at Ella without feeling the deep, aching wound of her betrayal. And he couldn't be around Jake without seeing the arrogance that had shattered his world. The sheriff tried to keep it together, to pretend that everything was fine, but it was becoming more and more impossible to maintain the facade. His behavior grew erratic. He snapped at colleagues, failed to respond to calls, and even began neglecting his duties. The weight of the secret was suffocating, and the pressure to keep it hidden from the community, his community, was unbearable. How could he face them with this knowledge? How could he look them in the eye and pretend everything was normal when his entire world had crumbled? The sheriff couldn't keep the truth in any longer. The betrayal festered in his soul, turning into something dark, something dangerous. The rage he had tried to suppress exploded in a moment of clarity. There was only one way to make it all stop. It happened late one evening, just after the sun dipped below the horizon. The sheriff had told Ella and Jake he needed time alone to think. But his mind was made up. He drove to the secluded cabin by the woods, the place where he had once spent so many quiet weekends with his family. The darkness of the night seemed to press in on him as he arrived. Ella and Jake were already there, waiting, both of them unaware of what was about to happen. The confrontation that followed was swift, brutal. The sheriff's anger exploded, his mind clouded with fury. He didn't know how it happened, but in a blur of rage, he grabbed the first thing he could find, a heavy, blunt object. Ella and Jake never saw it coming. The blows came fast and hard, a release of all the pain, the betrayal, the rage that had been boiling inside him for days. They were both dead within minutes. Their bodies lay motionless on the floor, the stillness of the room now filled with the sickening aftermath of what the sheriff had done. The blood. The finality. It was over. He didn't feel the relief he expected, only the weight of what he had just taken from the world. The lives of the two people he had loved most were gone, and in their place, there was nothing but emptiness. The bodies were discovered the following morning by a neighbor who had come by to check on them. The sight was horrifying. 2 lives cut short in a house that should have been filled with the warmth of family. Law enforcement quickly arrived at the scene, but nothing could prepare them for the discovery that followed. The sheriff was nowhere to be found. The crime scene told its own story. Blood splattered across the floor, the violent marks of a life taken in the heat of anger and betrayal. The house was eerily quiet, the remnants of a family torn apart lying in the shadows. No one could have known then that the sheriff was responsible, not yet, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The murder of Ella and Jake sent shockwaves through the small town. The tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other's business, was in complete disbelief. How could something so brutal, so senseless, happen here, in a place where people lived their whole lives without ever imagining such violence? The sheriff had been a pillar of the community, a man known for his sense of justice, his unwavering commitment to keeping the peace. Now the town found itself questioning everything, wondering if the person they had trusted most could really be capable of such a heinous act. In the days following the discovery of the bodies, the sheriff maintained his composure, too calm, too composed for someone whose family had just been torn apart. At first, his colleagues, the officers who had known him for years, were reluctant to even consider him a suspect. How could they? He was their sheriff, the man who had guided them through countless investigations, the man who had put the safety of his town above all else. They couldn't bring themselves to believe that he might be involved. But as the investigation progressed, their doubts began to grow. The sheriff's behavior was off. He avoided direct questions, deflected suspicions, and kept his distance from the investigation, all the while offering only vague details about where he had been the night of the murders. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, like a man who had already made peace with the inevitable. Forensic evidence at the crime scene painted a chilling picture. Blood spatter was found in multiple locations, suggesting that the victims had been attacked quickly and violently. No sign of a struggle. It was clear that Ella and Jake hadn't been expecting an assault. Their bodies showed blunt force trauma, with marks consistent with a heavy object. Ballistics reports ruled out gunfire, leaving investigators to focus on the physical violence. DNA found at the scene was traced back to the sheriff, unmistakable evidence that he had been there in the house at the time of the murders. The discovery raised even more questions. Was it possible he had committed the crime in a fit of rage, or was this something more calculated, premeditated? The evidence didn't yet tell the whole story, but it was enough to warrant suspicion. The sheriff's colleagues and fellow officers were torn. They had known him for years, worked beside him, and trusted him. But the forensic evidence couldn't be ignored. The case took a turn when investigators began interviewing neighbors, and the story they pieced together only deepened the mystery. One neighbor mentioned hearing heated arguments the night before, a loud confrontation coming from the direction of the sheriff's home. Another reported seeing the sheriff leave his house late that evening, but said he appeared off, walking in an unusual, almost stiff manner. No one had seen Jake or Ella since then, but their absence was noted by more than one person. A strange, unsettling feeling had hung in the air that night, but no one could pinpoint why. The children, who had been staying with a relative at the time, were too young to offer much insight into the events. But a family friend, someone who had been close to both Ella and Jake, provided a critical piece of information. She told investigators that, in the weeks leading up to the murders, there had been increasing tension in the sheriff's household. She recalled overhearing an argument between Ella and the sheriff, one in which Ella seemed to be apologizing for something. She wasn't sure what it was about, but it stuck with her. Could it have been about the affair? Had the sheriff found out? This new information placed more pressure on the investigators to reconsider their approach. Yet, the case was far from straightforward. Investigators were faced with a number of obstacles. False leads came flooding in, with some residents claiming they had seen suspicious cars near the sheriff's house the night of the murders, only for the sightings to be quickly debunked. Community pressure mounted as well. People were eager for answers, but there was a growing divide. Some still clung to the idea that the sheriff was innocent, while others began whispering that perhaps the man they had all trusted had finally snapped. But it wasn't until a breakthrough came in the form of an anonymous tip that the investigation took an unexpected turn. A letter, postmarked the day after the murders, arrived at the local police station. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear: the sheriff did it. I know what happened. The weapon is in his car. It was a bombshell, one that sent the investigation into overdrive. The tip had led them to a small, inconspicuous lockbox hidden under the sheriff's passenger seat. Inside they found a weapon, a blunt object, similar in shape and weight to the marks left on Ella and Jake's bodies. It was a chilling discovery. The sheriff had always been a man of principle, a man who followed the law to the letter. Yet here, in the quiet corner of his car, lay the very instrument that could potentially seal his fate. Was this the confession he had been too afraid to make? Or had someone planted the weapon to frame him? The investigators couldn't ignore the coincidence. The case had taken a drastic turn, one that led them to believe that the sheriff's involvement was no longer a matter of suspicion, it was becoming a reality. And as the investigation unfolded, one thing became painfully clear: the truth was far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. The day Sheriff Carter was arrested, the town fell silent. It was as though the heart of the community had been ripped out. On a cold morning, officers arrived at his doorstep, and with no more than a brief exchange, they placed him in handcuffs. The man who had once upheld the law was now a criminal in the eyes of everyone who had once trusted him. As the sheriff was led away in the back of a patrol car, the crowd gathered outside his house was split between disbelief and anger. Some whispered quietly, shaking their heads in confusion, while others shouted accusations, calling him a murderer. His family stood in shock, unable to grasp what had just unfolded. It wasn't just the sheriff's reputation that was on the line, it was the very foundation of the town itself. In the courtroom, emotions ran high. The defense team tried to build a case for temporary insanity, citing the overwhelming betrayal the sheriff had felt after discovering his brother's affair with his wife Ella. His attorney argued that this discovery, coupled with years of built-up resentment, had pushed him into a state of uncontrollable rage. The defense also claimed that the sheriff had no recollection of the murders, suggesting that he might have been in some kind of trance-like state when the killings occurred. They painted the picture of a man pushed to the edge, broken by the ultimate betrayal by the people he loved most. On the other side, the prosecution's case was clear and methodical. They argued that the sheriff, a man of discipline and control, had planned the murders in cold blood. They painted him as a man whose pride had been shattered, whose sense of honor had been destroyed, and who took matters into his own hands. They spoke of the weapon found in his car, the evidence of premeditation, and the DNA that placed him at the scene of the crime. This was no crime of passion, the prosecutor asserted. This was a calculated act of revenge, driven by nothing more than the sheriff's desire to reclaim his pride, his family, and his control. The testimonies were gut-wrenching. Family members, friends, and neighbors all took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted what they knew about the sheriff before and after the murders. One by one, they spoke of the sheriff's deep love for his children, his steadfast commitment to his job, and his seemingly perfect life. But then they described the gradual changes in him, his sleepless nights, his uncharacteristic mood swings, and the withdrawal from those closest to him. The courtroom was filled with a heavy weight of disbelief, as each witness tried to reconcile the man they knew with a man now accused of murder. The most emotional moments came when the sheriff's children were called to testify. The two young children, still innocent in many ways, were forced to answer questions about their parents' relationship and the chaotic events that had unraveled in their home. They spoke haltingly, their voices small as they tried to comprehend the situation. "My daddy used to be nice," one of the children said, his eyes wide with confusion. "He loved us. But now I don't know." The pain was evident on their faces, their confusion raw. They weren't just testifying against their father. They were struggling with a fundamental shift in their world, forced to reconcile the man they had loved with the person who had destroyed their family. The defense argued that the sheriff wasn't the killer, suggesting that someone else could have been involved. Perhaps someone from the community with a grudge against the sheriff or even his brother. But the prosecution tore apart that argument. They emphasized the sheriff's meticulous planning and the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. His control over the situation, they said, was undeniable. He had made sure the crime was covered up, attempting to make it look like an act of random violence. But there was no escaping the truth. As the trial came to a close, the jury retired to deliberate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. Everyone knew how much was riding on this decision. The sheriff's fate lay in their hands, and the weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. In the small town, where everyone had known everyone's business for years, the question lingered: could a man like Sheriff Carter really be capable of such a heinous act? The deliberation lasted for days. The jury was split, some members swayed by the emotional testimonies, while others were focused on the cold facts. The defense had made a compelling argument about the sheriff's emotional breakdown, but the evidence painted a darker picture. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the room held its breath. Guilty. The words rang out, cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. The sheriff stood, his face stoic, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker, regret perhaps, or acceptance. The community, still reeling from the revelation of the sheriff's betrayal, now had to face the reality of the man they once trusted being taken away in handcuffs. The trial had ended, but the damage was done. The sheriff's life was shattered, and the town, forever changed, could only look on as the once respected lawman was led away to serve his sentence. There were no winners in this case, only survivors of a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. And for the children caught in the crossfire, their lives would never be the same. After the trial, Sheriff Carter's life was never the same. The town, once proud of him and his unwavering dedication to justice, now viewed him with suspicion and pity. His tarnished reputation became the source of whispers in every corner of the community. The man who had once been a pillar of integrity was now broken, a victim of both betrayal and circumstance. The sheriff was acquitted, but his name, once synonymous with trust, was forever stained. He found himself a stranger in a town that no longer trusted him, his every move under scrutiny. The weight of his past decisions pressed on him like a constant, suffocating force. His marriage, built on a foundation of love and loyalty, had been shattered by secrets and lies. His wife Ella was gone, her death a tragic consequence of her own actions and the emotional maelstrom she had created. Their children, torn between their love for both their parents and the haunting reality of their betrayal, were left to grapple with a truth too painful to fully comprehend. The sheriff retreated from public life, isolating himself in a small rundown cabin just outside town. He spent his days in silence, haunted by the memory of the woman he had once loved and the brother who had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. There were no simple answers to the questions that plagued him. How could someone who had sworn to protect and serve fall so far from grace? How could he have missed the signs, the quiet warnings that had been hiding in plain sight for so long? The children of the sheriff, now left without both parents in the traditional sense, were perhaps the hardest hit. Their lives had been forever changed by the horrific events that had unfolded before their eyes. They were torn between the love they still felt for their father and the overwhelming sense of betrayal they had experienced. They had lost not only their mother, but their family as they had known it. Their world, once a place of safety and comfort, was now a maze of confusion and heartbreak. In the years that followed, the town would slowly attempt to rebuild. The sheriff's former colleagues, friends, and neighbors tried to move on, but the shadows of the past lingered. For many, the tragedy had become a part of their own personal history. The town square, once filled with pride, now stood as a silent reminder of the secrets that had been hidden for so long. But through it all, the one constant remained: the devastating impact of betrayal. The sheriff's story, his fall from grace, served as a stark reminder of the consequences that arise when trust is broken, when loyalty is manipulated, and when the truth is buried too deep. No one was left untouched by the tragedy, and the lessons learned were painfully clear. Loyalty, once broken, could never be fully restored. Secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, always found a way to surface. And in the end, no one, no matter how powerful or respected, was immune to the destructive power of deceit. As for Sheriff Carter, he would never fully recover. The man who had once stood tall, proud, and unwavering in his commitment to justice was now a broken figure, struggling to find redemption in a world that had turned its back on him. The pain of betrayal, the loss of his family, and the crushing weight of his tarnished reputation were burdens he would carry for the rest of his life. And for the town that had once revered him, they would never forget the lessons learned in the wake of a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. What would you have done if you were in Sheriff Carter's place? Could this tragedy have been avoided, or was the devastation inevitable once the secrets began to unravel? The lines between right and wrong can blur in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes, the choices we make can spiral into consequences far beyond our control. Take a moment to reflect. How would you have handled the same betrayal? How do we truly know the people we trust the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your theories, your opinions, and your reflections on this heart-wrenching case. If you found this story as gripping and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Berry Stories for more deep dives into the most chilling true crime stories. Your support helps us bring more of these compelling narratives to light.